Hello, my name is Kay Ueda. I'm curator of the Japanese Diaspora Collection and a research fellow at the Hoover Institution Library Archives at Stanford University. The Hoover Institution and the Japanese Association for Migration Studies are delighted to host the second international workshop on the Japanese diaspora. We'd like to thank the director of the Hoover Institution, Lisa Rice, for her support of the library archives and our programs. We also like to thank the endowment donor of the Japanese Diaspora Initiative, overseers of the Hoover Institution, our board of directors, and other donors without whose support, nothing we do would be possible. Now, just a few housekeeping notes. The webinar is recorded. The Q&A function becomes available for the webinar participants in session 3 and the discussion in the afternoon. During the break, we will turn off the camera and microphones. Now, let me introduce the workshop chair, Professor Eiichiro Azuma. Eiichiro Azuma is a professor of history and Asian American studies at the University of Pennsylvania. He specializes in Japanese American history and trans-Pacific migration, diaspora, settler colonialism, and inter-imperial relations between the United States and Japan. He's the author of 2 monographs titled Between Two Empires, Race, History, and Transnationalism in Japanese America, and In Search of a Frontier, Japanese America and Settler Colonialism in the Construction of Japan's Borderless Empire. Since 2019, we are delighted to have Professor Azuma as a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, and he has been involved in the Japanese Diaspora Initiative. Now let's welcome Professor Azuma.
Good. Thank you, Dr. Ueda. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. It is my great pleasure to formally commence this international workshop sponsored by the Japanese Association for Migration Studies and the Hoover Institution. And my name is Eiichiro Azuma. I am the workshop chair today. Now, without further ado, I'd like to actually introduce the chair of the first session, session 1, which will start soon. The Professor Jun Uchida will be the chair of the session 1. She's associate professor and department vice chair of history here at Stanford University. Her award-winning first monograph, Brokers of Empire, Japanese settler colonialism in Korea, 1876-1945, published by Harvard University Press, is a path-breaking historical study that sheds light on the importance of migration and settler community formation in colonial Korea. Taking the theme of colonial migration and diaspora even further, her second monograph, Provincializing Empire, Omi Merchants in the Japanese Trans-Pacific Diaspora, will be published soon by the University of California Press. I'm going to just pass the baton to Professor Jun Uchida to start the session 1.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Professor Azuma, for your kind introduction, and thank you, Kay, for inviting me to participate in this exciting workshop. I'm a newcomer to Trans-Pacific history myself, so I look forward to learning a lot from the presentations today. I also have to apologize in advance. I have to miss the last half of the workshop today because I have to go teach all afternoon, but I hope to hear all about it over dinner later on. So it's my pleasure to introduce the first speaker for the workshop, Professor Yu Tokunaga, who received his PhD in history from the University of Southern California in 2018, and is currently Associate Professor of History at the Graduate School of Global Environmental Studies with a joint appointment at the Graduate School of Human and Environmental Studies, Kyoto University. The title of his presentation is The Saburo Mashiko Murder Case, the Post-1924 Migration of Japanese Women and Crimes in the U.S.-Mexico Border.
My name is Yu Tokunaga. I'm very honored and happy to be here today, and I want to thank Ueda-san and her team at the Hoover Institution, as well as the Japanese Association for Migration Studies, for organizing this workshop. And you can see the title of my paper again on the slide. And there is a map of the borderlands I am going to talk about too. Okay, so in December 1926, Saburo Mashiko, the secretary of the Japanese Association in the Mexican border city of Mexicali, Baja California, was found dead and buried under the patio of the association building. His death shocked the ethnic Japanese communities of both Baja California and Southern California, particularly because those arrested for the murder were 3 other Japanese immigrants allegedly involved in human trafficking of Japanese women across the Pacific Ocean. Comprehensive history books about Japanese Mexican history, such as Nichiboku Koryushi, discuss the Mashiko murder case as a major crime. However, little scholarly attention has been paid to this incident. By framing Mashiko's murder through the specific historical context of the 1920s US-Mexico borderlands, this paper examines how the Japanese legation in Mexico, the Japanese consulate in Los Angeles, and the Mexican government communicated with one another regarding the Japanese suspects, and how ethnic Japanese communities on both sides of the US-Mexico border reacted to the Mashiko's murder. For primary sources, this paper draws on Mexican government documents preserved at the National Archives of Mexico, as well as Japanese and English language newspapers in Southern California available at digital archives such as the Hoji Shimbun digital collection. This picture is the front page of the Mexican government documents related to Mashiko. The 1924 Immigration Act marked a turning point in Japanese American history as well as US history at large. This law prohibited the entry of Japanese immigrants altogether. It also affected Japanese immigration to Mexico and the relationship between the ethnic Japanese communities in the United States and Mexico. Before 1924, the Gentleman's Agreement signed by both Japanese and the US governments prohibited the entry of Japanese laborers into the United States. It also prevented Japan from sending its nationals to Mexico because many Japanese illegally entered the United States from Mexico. The 1924 Act, however, unilaterally nullified the Gentleman's Agreement and made it possible for the Japanese government to issue passports to those Japanese who wanted to go to Mexico. As a result, the Mexican border city of Mexicali became home to one of the largest concentrations of Japanese nationals in Mexico. After 1924, many Japanese in Mexicali began to bring over their relatives from Japan as yobiyose immigrants, including women. The number of Japanese residents in Baja California increased from about 400 in 1921 to about 1,000 in 1930. Japanese in Mexicali read Japanese language newspapers published in Los Angeles, purchased goods from Southern California, and the Japanese consulate in Los Angeles was in charge of monitoring and protecting its citizens in Baja California. Thus, both ethnic Japanese communities in Baja California and Southern California constituted a larger trans-border ethnic Japanese community with Los Angeles as its center. My recently published book discusses this trans-border ethnic Japanese community more in detail. Regarding the migration of Japanese women in the United States, the Japanese government stopped so-called picture brides from entering the United States in 1920 in order to appease anti-Japanese sentiment. But it is also important to remember that the 1924 Act prohibited Japanese residents in the United States from calling over their relatives as yobiyose altogether. Even if Japanese immigrant men went back to Japan to get married, they were no longer able to bring their wives to the United States. Japanese in the West Coast regarded the ban on yobiyose immigrants of women as a humanitarian problem that would deny Japanese immigrants an opportunity to form a family. This is an important aspect of the 1924 Act in terms of the migration of Japanese women in the US-Mexico borderlands. In the 1924, Yobiyose migration of Japanese women ended in the United States, but started in Mexico. The Mashiko murder case took place in this historical context. This is a picture of Mashiko printed on a local English paper in Calexico. On December 16, 1926, someone set on fire the building of the Japanese Association of Mexicali. Later, Mashiko's body was found at the site of incinerated association building. There was a rumor that Mashiko was killed and the association building was burned down in relation to the problem regarding the closure of a brothel. Meanwhile, someone withdrew $2,000 from the association's account at a bank in Calexico, an American border city directly across from Mexicali. By the end of December, 2 Japanese in Mexicali and another Japanese in Los Angeles were arrested for the murder of Mashiko, the theft of the association's fund, and the arson of the association's building. These men were Ryokichi Morishita, the previous president of the Japanese Association of Mexicali, Shinichi Morishita, Ryokichi's younger brother, and the Kiyoji Ikuta, a resident in Los Angeles. Japanese diplomats in Mexico and Los Angeles quickly responded to the shocking situation. On December 28th, the Mexican Ministry of the Interior received a message from the Japanese legation in Mexico regarding Mashiko's death. The legation informed them that, quote, the murderer, who would very probably be Japanese, and who had old quarrels with the above mentioned Mr. Mashiko on the occasion that he had intervened in the exploitation of a wicked house and made the women who had been exploited go back to Japan in accordance with the direction of the Japanese consulate in Los Angeles, California, whose jurisdiction the above mentioned city of Mexicali belongs, end quote. 3 months earlier, in September, Mashiko had a conflict with some Japanese regarding the immigration of women to Mexico. According to the Rakushimpo, a major Japanese newspaper in Southern California, quote, Japanese rogues opened a brothel in Mexicali, end quote, by deceiving Japanese Yobiyose women, as well as the local authorities. The leaders of the Mexicali Japanese community told the Rakushimpo that alleged brothel would trample on the feelings of Mexicali Japanese and, quote, later lead to serious problems for them in calling over wives and family members from Japan, end quote. At that time, the Japanese Association of Mexicali functioned as an administrative outpost of the Japanese consulate in Los Angeles to handle immigration documents related to Yobiyose immigrants to Mexicali. Mashiko explained to the Japanese consulate in Los Angeles that there was no brothel operating, but there were 4 women disguised as Yobiyose wives brought over from Japan to work as shakufu, which means barmaid or waitress. After their arrival, one of the 4 sham marriage couples became a real couple and disappeared from Mexicali. The remaining 3 women were Ken Hamaguchi, Kumie Kamiya, and Michie Shinohara. Hamaguchi and Kamiya were former factory workers of a spinning company called Izumi Boseki in Osaka, and Shinohara, a former factory worker of a government-owned Monopoly Bureau branch in Hiroshima. The Monopoly Bureau, or Senbaikyoku in Japanese, administered the production of tobacco, salt, and camphor. Particularly, the monopoly of the tobacco industry was an important revenue source for the Japanese government. This is a picture of the Monopoly Bureau branch in Hiroshima taken before World War II. You can see female workers there in the picture. The 3 women, Hamaguchi, Kamiya, and Shinohara, were brought from Japan by a restaurant owner named Yoshimatsu Tsuchiya, who lived in El Centro in the Imperial Valley in the United States. Tsuchiya lent these women money for travel costs and arranged their sham marriages. These women needed to work as barmaids, shakufu, to pay back their debts. Although Mexico publicly denied the presence of brothel, the Japanese legation in Mexico understood that these women were exploited by the sex industry. These women, therefore, were most likely victims of human trafficking across the Pacific Ocean. The Japanese consulate in Los Angeles took the entry of these women into Mexico seriously and suspended their administrative relationship with the Japanese Association of Mexicali. The consulate restored this relationship in November when 2 women were sent back to Japan, while the remaining one became, quote, perfectly married as a wife, end quote, and began to work in the cotton farm together with her husband in Mexicali. The problem of sham yobiyose marriages was apparently resolved from the perspectives of the Japanese Association and the consulate in Los Angeles. On the other hand, through the entire process, these women remained at the mercy of the trans-Pacific sex industry, as well as the association and consulate's policy to save face by removing activities from the ethnic Japanese communities removing such activities from the ethnic Japanese community in the US-Mexico borderlands. They were deemed as undesirable and simply removed from the ethnic Japanese community in one way or another. It is difficult to know the details of these women's experiences. One of the very few pieces of information about these women is that they were factory workers in Japan before moving to the United States. From the turn of the 20th century, factories in Japan hired an increasing number of female workers from the countryside. Female factory workers in the spinning and the tobacco industries played an important role in the Japanese economy in the 1920s. Probably some of these yobiyose women originally came from the countryside of Japan, worked in the industrial area, and became victims of human trafficking across the Pacific Ocean. In this sense, their migration to Mexico took place in the historical intersection between the industrialization of Japan that depended on female workers and the exclusion of Japanese women in the United States in the 1920s. After the death of Mashiko, Japanese immigrants on both sides of the US-Mexico border together launched a fundraising campaign calling for donations to express condolences and to support the investigation. A picture taken at Mashiko's funeral shows us that many people mourned his death. On January 11th, 1927, when the search for potential suspects was still continuing, Japanese legation in Mexico sent a memorandum to the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs, emphasizing the necessity of international collaboration between Japan, Mexico, and the United States. As seen in the fundraising campaign and the investigation on both sides of the border, the Mashiko murder case was not simply a homicide in Mexico, but a transnational crime in the US-Mexico borderland. At around the beginning of September 1927, the Japanese legation in Mexico informed the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs that Mexicali Japanese were very concerned about the possible release of the suspects who had been considered as harmful since before the incident. The legation added, quote, "The consulate of Japan in Los Angeles, taking in consideration the desires of the Japanese Association of Mexicali, and the majority of Japanese residents in Calexico and Los Angeles, has agreed to request Mr. President of the Republic of Mexico to dictate his respectable orders so that those mentioned Japanese, Kyoji Ikuta and Shinichi Morishita, get expelled from the country in case that they get released," end quote. The Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs understood that the Japanese legation's concern and shared a memorandum with the Mexican Interior Secretary. About a week before the above-mentioned about communication between the Mexican ministries, Ryokichi Morishita was released from the prison due to lack of evidence. Ryokichi's younger brother, Shinichi, was once sentenced to death, but later acquitted in 1929. The third suspect, Ikuta, was a Los Angeles-based Japanese arrested in Calexico. Before his death, Mashiko was forced to send checks, which were later signed by receivers named Kimura and Kondo. But the Mexicali police found that Ikuta's handwriting was very similar to those of Kimura and Kondo, and considered that Ikuta wrote counterfeit signatures to the checks. Japanese immigrant newspapers and the diplomatic correspondence between the Japanese legation and the Mexican government demonstrate that Japanese immigrants had little doubt that Shinichi and Ikuta in particular played a leading role in the murder of Mashiko. According to the Nichiboku Koryushi, there was a rumor that the Los Angeles-based Japanese mafia organization called the Tokyo Club was behind the unlawful migration of the Yobiyose women, who were sent back to Japan by Mashiko. Prohibition in the United States resulted in the development of the sex industry and restaurant businesses that served liquor across the border in Mexicali. The Tokyo Club was considered an organization that profited from this situation. The Mashiko murder case saw a further shocking development when Ikuta was murdered by a Mexican inmate named Jesus Torres, imprisoned in November 1927. Torres, who had been in jail for the theft and assault, allegedly stabbed Ikuta's heart with a sharpened wire. This imprisoned murder generated much attention from the media in Japan as well as in Los Angeles. The Tokyo Asahi Shimbun reported that Ikuta was known as a dangerous person in the Los Angeles Japanese community, as he had been related to the Tokyo Club. The murder of Ikuta further terrified the ethnic Japanese community in Mexicali. On December 22nd, the Japanese legation in Mexico sent a memorandum to the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs, stating, quote, the general belief that the murder of Mashiko and that of Ikuta are very closely related in terms of the motives prevails among Japanese residents in Mexicali, and because of the fear that crimes of similar nature might repeat, the state of mind of Japanese residents in Mexicali is very uneasy, end quote. Accordingly, the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs contacted the Interior Ministry so that the local authorities of Baja California would protect Japanese residents. Ikuta's mysterious death generated a sense of fear among the Mexicali Japanese and made it difficult to reveal the whole truth of Mashiko's death. This, on the right of the slide, is the headline of the Asahi Shimbun saying, Moto Sodai no Ikuta Senshu. So Ikuta was a Waseda graduate, so that caught the attention of the media. And below is the part of the Mexican government document saying, Los ánimos de los japoneses están sumamente intranquilos. So basically the Mexicali Japanese are feeling very uneasy at the time. Conclusion, what was the Mashiko murder case after all? It was not just an ordinary homicide in Mexico. It was a crime that reveals a trans-Pacific dimension of the Japanese immigrant experience in the US-Mexico borderlands, where the US Immigration Act of 1924 sparked the unlawful and forced migration of Japanese women across the Pacific Ocean and the conflicts within the trans-border ethnic Japanese community in the US-Mexico borderlands. So the Mashiko case is an example of trans-Pacific history that intersects local relations with international relations around the Pacific Ocean. As I have mentioned in this paper, one of the Yobiyose women chose to live with a Japanese man in Mexicali. This episode seems to show her agency in making her own choice to settle in Mexico rather than simply obeying the consulate's repatriation policy. It is difficult but important to collect small pieces of information like this episode to better understand the Mashiko murder case and the formation of the trans-border ethnic Japanese community in the 1920s. I have just started this research project, so I appreciate your comments and questions.
The second presenter is Midori Komatsu Hidaka. She is a Japanese Dominican PhD student at Doshisha University's Graduate School of Global Studies in Kyoto. The title of her talk is Racial Geopolitics in the Caribbean, Creating the Japanese Migrants in the Dominican Pigmentocracy.
Hi, good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you for inviting me over to present. My name is Midori Hidaka, and I am at Stanford University, and my paper title is Racial Geopolitics in the Caribbean, Locating the Japanese Migrants in the Dominican Republic. First, I will provide a brief introduction and objective of the paper. So during the 1950s, hundreds of Japanese families arrived in the Caribbean island nation of the Dominican Republic, or the DR, as permanent settlers. Their arrival was part of a bilateral government-sponsored program with contrasting motivations from both sides. While the government of Japan sought to address the supposed threat of overpopulation that came after World War II, the Dominican government, which was under the dictatorship of Rafael Trujillo, sought to establish a quote-unquote control over the Dominican-Haitian border on their shared island of Hispaniola. The Japanese permanent migrants were to boost agricultural production and simultaneously serve as a supposed whitening measure or human shield against the groundless belief of a Haitian invasion into Dominican territory. The placement of the Japanese migrants in a supposed positive position to contrast the omission of Blackness in the DR provides a complex perspective of national belonging, ethno-racial and diasporic identities within a society based on skin color hierarchies, also known as pigmentocracies. This presentation aims to address the historical role the Japanese migrants had in the Dominican-Haitian border, as well as its impressions within the Dominican pigmentocracy. And now I will explain the historical background. So the Dominican Republic and the Republic of Haiti share the Caribbean island of Hispaniola, which is part of the Greater Antilles. Both the DR and Haiti have a history of animosity, which can be highlighted by two major events. The first one is the Dominican independence from Haiti. Unlike most countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, or LAC, the DR celebrates its independence from its neighboring nation and not from a European colonial power. This sharply contrasts with the Haitian Revolution led by former enslaved Africans, which resulted in Haiti's independence from France in 1804. Not long after Haiti's independence, the Spanish ruled side of the island, which today is the DR, began to move towards independence as well. However, from 1822 until 1844, Haiti came to occupy the entirety of the island in what came to be known as the Haitian occupation. During the occupation, Dominican white elites became instrumental in the independence movement against the Black Republic of Haiti, which was achieved on February 27th of 1844. This marked the foundation of a cultural divide in which French Creole speaking and supposedly voodoo practicing in Haiti went against the Spanish-speaking Catholic side in the Dominican Republic. Almost a century later, anti-Haitian sentiment was ignited by the Dominican dictator, Rafael Trujillo. This was the second major historical event that marked the relationship between the two countries. Trujillo ruled the DR from 1930 until 1961, a period that came to be known as El Trujillato. During the Trujillato, the massacre of an estimated 15,000 ethnic Haitians took place between the 2nd and 8th of October in 1937. This massacre significantly marked Dominican-Haitian relations, which the Dominican elite and intellectuals have been motivating through anti-Haitian propaganda alongside Trujillo's command to strictly mark the geographical border between these two nations. Years before the Haitian genocide, the border had been a disputed zone since there was not an officially established division of land between the DR and Haiti. Furthermore, the borderlands have become an area of multicultural exchange and intermingling of ethnic Haitians and ethnic Dominicans and the descendants of these unions. In this massive act of violence, Trujillo was establishing his control over the Haitian-Dominican border and placing the Dominican elites that have been following eugenic ideologies that exalted white Spanish heritage as quote-unquote more educated and modern, while contrasting Black heritage as a quote-unquote uncivilized. Historian Richard Lee Torres explains that Dominican intellectuals represented the Haitian presence in the Dominican frontier as a Pacific invasion that was endangering the Dominican nation. This quote-unquote invasion was supposedly Haitianizing and Africanizing the Dominican frontier, rendering popular Dominican culture more savage and backwards, and injecting new and undesirable African admixtures into the Dominican social composition. Consequently, Trujillo had to diminish the spotlight on the massacre, given its context right before World War II. The unstable situation in Europe gave Trujillo's regime the opportunity to uplift its international reputation by inviting European refugees to the DR during the Evian Conference of 1938. Adjacently, Trujillo was also motivated to place European migrants on the Dominican-Haitian border to quote-unquote whiten the population in these areas, as well as grow agricultural production. However, this plan backfired, given that most of the European migrants only saw the DR as a temporary stopover before heading to other places such as the US. As many of these European migrants left the DR, it didn't take long for Trujillo to find a possible replacement for the failed European agricultural settlement by shifting the focus to Asia. Once the US occupation ended in post-war Japan, the Japanese government began to organize and encourage the population from mostly southern rural areas to migrate to Latin America and the Caribbean or Inland Sea. The year's pursuit of agricultural migrants to place at the border coincided with Japan's quest to send off their people. Talks began in 1954 between the two countries to explore the possibility of a migration agreement, and after further negotiations, this became a reality 2 years later. On July 26 of 1956, the ship Brasil Maru brought the first group of 28 Japanese families composed of 186 individuals who disembarked in Ciudad Trujillo, which today is the capital city of Santo Domingo. By 1959, a total of 250 Japanese families composed of 1,319 individuals settled in different colonies throughout the country. Most of these Japanese agricultural colonies were strategically placed on the Dominican-Haitian border, but a few were also placed in the central mountainous regions that were more fertile than those in the arid lands at the border settlements. As you can see in the map, it shows the black dots where the Japanese colonies were placed. You can see most of them are near the border between Haiti and the DR. And Aragua Constanza are the ones in the middle where the mountainous regions were. What motivated these Japanese families to come to the DR was the offering of free land, as well as the Japanese government advertisement of a supposed Caribbean paradise. However, many issues arose with the migration program, given that most of the land was not prepared for agricultural production. There was also a lack of proper infrastructure, such as roads to the markets to sell products, and there was even a mistranslation regarding the amount of land that was to be provided. These issues became further exacerbated with the assassination of Trujillo in 1961. After the assassination of Trujillo, sociopolitical unrest, as well as the ongoing issues with the land, led the majority of the Japanese families to return to their home country or migrate to other parts of LAC, such as Brazil. Of the 1,319 original Japanese migrants, only 276 remain in the DR after 1962. This is less than 40% of the original total group, which led the settlement to be labeled as a supposed failure. Not long after this failed settlement, it will become the source of a divisive lawsuit against the Japanese government. This lawsuit was filed by some of the Japanese migrants that remained in the DR as well as others that had left. This created a rupture between those that were for and those that were against the lawsuit. The escalation of this rift was even visible during the 50th anniversary of the migrants' arrival, when two separate parties were organized by different Japanese community associations within an already very small community. In a research study regarding this lawsuit, anthropologist Yadira Perez Hazel concluded that the prosecuting Japanese immigrants reconciled simultaneous national belongings and citizens of one state and yet resident members of another, refusing to make a unilateral choice between Japan and the DR. Even in the face of their lawsuit against the Japanese government, Japanese immigrants' understanding of their identity were situational, elastic, and even conflicted at times. However, they argue that their national or ethnic identity had little to do with their right to demand retribution, derailing the use of national discourses that could have quote-unquote other them and possibly invalidated their civil action suit. In this legal narrative, the Japanese immigrants attempted to define themselves as Japanese nationals, as well as unrealized middle-class Dominicans, in an effort to solidify their status as respectable and dignified people in both locales. Despite the numerous challenges and conflicts, many of the Japanese migrants that decided to stay in the DR have been able to integrate into Dominican society by forming Japanese American families and finding financial stability through entrepreneurship. As of March of 2020, the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs estimates there are 800 Japanese descendants and 721 Japanese nationals living in the DR. The survival of this small minority group provides a new layer to explore the ethno-racial landscape of the DR and possibly other parts of LAC. Next, I will explain more broadly the ethno-racial context of the DR in relation to Latin America and the role of Asian diasporas in the region. After the arrival of Columbus to the Americas in 1492, this region became the center of European invasion, as well as the genocide and enslavement of the remaining indigenous peoples and the African slave trade. In turn, this also brought new narratives of race and color due to the high level of racial mixture. Even though Latin America and the Caribbean is known to contain a high number of mixed populations, there is still a continuing exaltation of lighter skin color and closeness to whiteness. Today, this has led the region to be plagued by societies with hierarchies of inequalities, which are based on skin color and ethno-racial categories, also known as pigmentocracies. This concept was conceived in 1944 by Chilean anthropologist Alejandro Lipschitz and further developed by sociologist Edward Kells and the Project on Ethnicity and Race in Latin America, also known as PERLA. In LAC's pigmentocracies, African and indigenous heritage, as well as darker skin, tends to be placed at the bottom, whereas whiteness and lighter skin at the top. Within this framework, the Dominican Republic fits the parameters of a pigmentocracy, and its relationship with neighboring Haiti is a focal point. The incorporation of other migrant groups, such as the Japanese and their descendants, provide a more nuanced understanding of whiteness linked with foreigners and higher socioeconomic status as well. Other pigmentocratic societies in LAC, such as Brazil, provides clues to understand the status of the Japanese diaspora in this region. In a study of Japanese Brazilians, anthropologist Takeyuki Tsuda classified this group as a supposed positive minority, given the advantages this group appears to enjoy in Brazilian society. Tsuda defines positive minorities as groups that are small numerically and that are not the dominant political power holders in a society, but that enjoy a generally higher socioeconomic status than the majority of the populace and whose distinctive cultural qualities and social position are respected, if not admired. The view on whiteness in LAC and the DR have a correlation with higher socioeconomic status in which Japanese Brazilians and Japanese Dominicans have been able to use as a tool to maneuver the pigmentocracy within the pigmentocracy. However, anthropologist Nobuko Adachi argued against this positive status assigned to the Japanese diaspora in Brazil. Adachi explains that regardless of being born and raised in Brazil, and most having never been to Japan, Japanese Brazilians are still constantly marked as Japanese or foreigner. This myth of a positive minority status could also serve to describe the situation of Japanese Dominicans, given that there is a positive correlation between being of Japanese descent and the international reputation of Japan, alongside a foreigner status in the DR. Furthermore, given the small number of Japanese Dominicans, which is an estimated 1,500, they have not made enough of a visual impact on Dominican demographics, which has a population of almost 11 million, according to the World Bank. However, other Asian groups that have a larger and historically longer presence, such as Chinese migrants and Chinese Dominicans, do encounter certain negative experiences with more frequency. In the DR, there is a distinction between Japanese Dominicans and Chinese Dominicans, while still lumping them together as all Asians being Chinese. This goes back to the minority status and number, but also the lack of acknowledgement into Dominican national identity. Even when positive attributes are used to describe Japanese Dominicans, the separation between a Dominican of Japanese descent in comparison to a Dominican of non-Asian descent is clear because of the persevering ideologies of European, indigenous, and African mixtures. As we previously saw, the geopolitical play during Trujillo's regime to place Japanese settlers as a replacement to white European migrants in the borderlands with Haiti exemplifies the complex narratives of ethno-racial construction in a Dominican pigmentocracy. Overall, the role Japanese migrants had in the Dominican-Haitian border stemmed from a history of anti-Haitian sentiment, which led to the pursuit of this border widening as well as boosting agricultural production. In turn, the introduction of Japanese migrants as a supposed solution to the Africanization of the border may broaden perspectives of pigmentocracies by questioning the correlation between closeness to whiteness and national belonging. In LAC, the perseverance of the mixed trifecta of European, African, and indigenous mestizaje, or mixtures, which dilutes and diminishes African and, in some cases, indigenous heritage, it also tends to exclude Asian groups such as the Japanese Dominicans, because they're viewed as foreign and other by the majority. Within the Dominican pigmentocracy, Japanese Dominicans could potentially challenge ideas of national belonging and ethno-racial constructions, given that the other status may become irrelevant as these communities continue to integrate and intermarry into mainstream society.
The next speaker is Rashad Kashan, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge, Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. And the title of his talk is Between Subjection and Citizenship, 1930s Japanese Language Schools and Nikkei Citizenry in Hawaii.
Thank you for the introduction. It's good to be here. Hopefully my talk today will be more coherent than yesterday's stream of consciousness. But yeah, to those of you who haven't met, my name is Rashad, and thank you for the introduction. Being a PhD student means that my work is never, ever complete. So I'm really looking forward to your feedback and where you think I can improve on my work. So I'd like to hear from you. So thank you for your attention, or thank you in advance for your attention and for your thoughts. Fundamental to my presentation, what I'm going to be discussing today is the relationship between education and citizenry. Education is a self-explanatory concept, but citizenry refers to a set of morals and responsibilities that define one's relationships to public civic life. Education is the avenue through which the state conveys that citizenry. Nation makers use education as a tool to foster national civic morality and responsibility. But what happens when the national mold is insufficient for the needs of a given community? In the case of the Japanese community in 1930s Hawaii, using a broad Japanese language education infrastructure it took measures into its own hands. By examining 1930s language education and the Nikkei citizenry the community wished to develop, I examined how the community saw itself within the triangular relationship of Hawaii, the United States, and Japan. We examined educational materials such as school commemorations, yearbooks, essay compilations, textbooks, some of them are pictured up on the slide, to determine what did Nikkei citizenry mean for the Japanese Hawaiian community in the 1930s. And these materials, supplemented by Hoover's Hoji Shimbun collection, thank you, Kay, have allowed me to uncover the history of how Japanese education evolved over the course of the decades. And what we find is that Japanese language schools were not only there to teach language, but to develop the next generation of Nikkei citizens, and that the community was quite divided on how to do so. And much of that resentment was fueled by controversies that had been brewing for decades. However, it becomes clear that legitimacy and unity on matters of education came from both direct and indirect influence from Japan, a marker of the integrated relationship between the Japanese Hawaiian community and the Japanese Empire. And lastly, when it comes to Nikkei citizenry, it was defined by a core set of what were seen as Japanese values with responsibilities at the local, national, and international levels, which reflect on the position of the community itself. But before I really get into it, why am I talking about this specific time period? Japanese language schools have a long history in Hawaii, one that goes back to the beginning of the century, and it's a history that has been written about extensively. Scholars have done a particularly in-depth job of examining what was called the Japanese language school controversy of the 1920s. And just for quick context, for those who are not aware, over the course of the early 20s, the Hawaiian territorial government enacted a series of legislative restrictions on foreign language schools. Certain members of the community chose to cooperate with the government, and others fought the restrictions in court. And their case eventually reached the US Supreme Court, who in 1927 ruled that these restrictions were unconstitutional. Very little, however, has been written about what happens in this controversy's aftermath. And that's where my research comes into play. Focused on the years between 1927 and the US entry into the Second World War in 1941, I examine what happened in a Japanese Hawaiian community in an era that I can only describe as a golden era for Japanese language education. In this period, there were new schools being constructed, new textbooks being written, an attendance rate that kept climbing, and a strong centralized voice for education that drove standardization. At this time, I argue that it's the first time we can possibly see Japanese Hawaiian education, not simply Japanese education in Hawaii. And in line with much research and evidence by all the people here today, I hope to also widen the scope of Japanese pre-war influence to beyond its territories, to demonstrate how Japanese Hawaiian community were part of a trans-Pacific network of educational exchange. And lastly, I am to define the citizenry that was crafted in schools, and how language played a key role as a conduit for education and citizenry that was not impeded by borders, but fueled by the transnationality it embodied. It was as Nichihara Kusai put it in 1940, for all of this to be accomplished, it was necessary above all else to use the Japanese language. In July 1927, and the meeting is pictured here, the Hawaii Kyoikukai, or the Educational Association, gathered in Honolulu to establish a new organization. Having suspended operations since 1920, the Kyoikukai in these meetings defined new organizational structures and procedures with the goal of developing and standardizing language education across the islands. It was at this meeting, however, that issues that would come to plague the organization were set into motion. The first issue became centralization of educational authority in Honolulu. The July meetings were attended by representatives from educational associations across the islands. And in order to represent all of their interests, a governing body of managing directors would be elected and run the Honolulu-based organization. Not coincidentally, the first board of directors were all from Honolulu, and in the meetings, it was decided that the organization would inherit the textbooks rights and distribute on behalf of the Honolulu Educational Association. What emerged from the founding meetings was supposed to be a quasi-federal organization that was looking out for all of Hawaii, but it turned out to be focused primarily on Honolulu. And the second point of friction that came out of this was related to who did and didn't contribute with the territorial government as part of the 1920s language controversy. The rivalry between leaders such as Takie Okumura and the Hawaii Kyoikukai, or that between the two daily newspapers, the Nippujiji and the Hawaii Hochi, have been well documented. What's key is that these rivalries continue to fuel fractures well into the 1930s. In these meetings, prominent leaders like Okumura were left out of the proceedings. And in response, Okumura founded the Nihongo Kyoiku Kyokai in 1930. The goal of which was to move Japanese language education from Japanese language schools and into the public education system. And here on the side, we can see a couple recruitment advertisements to demonstrate how they competed with one another for new students to sign up. This was another model for Japanese language learning, one that argued that Japanese teaching should be about language and all else should be in line with the goals of public education. In the summer of 1931, these community fractures came to a head. After a rise in textbook prices, the Nippujiji on July 17, 1931, put into question the leadership and accounting of the Hawaii Kyoikukai. What followed was, as you can see by some of the headlines here, back and forth attacks in the press about accounting procedures, textbook prices, overall mismanagements. And on the one side, you had the Hawaii Hochi defending the Kyoikukai, telling the Nippujiji to leave it alone, we'll solve it. And on the other side, you had the Nippujiji demanding everything be made public for the sake of truth. One particular organization within the, one particular issue within the Hawaii Kyoikukai had been that the Honolulu representatives, elected 4 years earlier, had taken their fair share, more than their fair share of the center of power. And inflamed by these new accusations, rural areas began to air their grievances. General meetings of the Hawaii Island Kyoikukai erupted in uproar. The Maui Kyoikukai demanded that the board of directors resign, and a special conference be held to deal with the matters at hand. And what ensued was a controversy that was so critical, it was described as threatening the survival of the Hawaii Kyoikukai as a whole, whose survival at this point, after its success, we should not take for granted at this nascent stage. So in August 1931, a special conference was held, bringing representatives in from all of the major Hawaiian islands. On the first day, the former managing directors resigned and a new board was elected. And over the next 10 days, the community debated on what to do regarding an audit of the organization's accounting. Some dismissed these accusations, calling them irresponsible or a misunderstanding, but others demanded that a fund be set aside for an independent audit. After this standstill, unable to make a decision, the body turned to Japanese General Consul in Hawaii, Iwate Yoshiro. They pleaded to him on what to do regarding this audit. And after conferring with other leaders in the community, Iwate decided that an audit would not be necessary, but formal accounting procedures, as he said, would be put in place moving forward. And I argue that this begins to demonstrate how Japan and its influence acted as a unifying force in Hawaii. The consulate was a marker of legitimacy for a decision made on behalf of the party. And in the end, even the Nippujiji acquiesced. In the editorial following the decision, the paper stated that while they believed it would not solve the problem, they had no choice but to accept the final result. Legitimacy, that's a tough word. Legitimacy from Japan was a tool that the Kyoikukai actively pursued. Over the decade, they crafted Japanese language education in direct dialogue with Japan. And by doing so, they legitimized themselves as the purveyors of Nikkei citizenry with dominion over language and cultural cultivation. It began by bringing over Japanese educational thinkers to help guide language education in Hawaii. In 34 and 35, they brought over men like Nishihara Keiichi and Nosei Hiroaki to Seikei Gakuen professors with accolades for the Ministry of Education. You can see here a clipping of one of the lectures given by Nishihara. Both Nishihara and Nosei, who's pictured there in the middle, were renowned members of a burgeoning educational studies movement in the 1930s. And they spoke all over Hawaii on how to better teach Japanese and that students should be a part of the Japanese nation and carry Japanese morality abroad. These trips demonstrated how the language education the Hawaii Kyoikukai crafted continued to be propelled by Japanese educational thought, sponsored by emissaries, rubber stamped by the Ministry of Education. And the Hawaii Kyoikukai turned towards individual personal connections to Japan to fill the void of Japanese teachers in Hawaii. It did so by recruiting many Kibe Nisei who were born in the United States, spent a lot of time in Japan and so-called returned. And this was often facilitated by family connections, sending children to go live in their families' hometowns in Japan. People like Shozo Takahashi, pictured here, were educated as teachers in Japan and were in high demand to work as Japanese language teachers in Hawaii. And lastly, the Hawaii Kyoikukai relied on schools in Japan to further this teacher movement. It sent rounds of students to Japan to learn how to become better language teachers. It was not a small recruiting base. By 36, around a third of all Japanese language school teachers in Hawaii had spent time studying in this fashion. The Hawaii Kyoikukai viewed Japan as a place to develop Japanese language. But a connection to it meant that inherently you had a better claim on teaching the Japanese language. Thus, it sought its legitimacy through Japan. Played an active role in propagating various levels of Japanese influence into each and every Japanese language school. And within these schools that Nikkei citizenry was cultivated. This was first done by establishing a set of core values that were attributed to be Japanese. These morals were imbued in morality textbooks, as well as fortified by school traditions, songs, mottos, daily practices. They were everywhere. And they were in service of multiple layers of responsibilities critical to Nikkei citizenry. The first level of which was demonstrating loyalty to the United States, which was often defined as being a law-abiding citizen. And while on the one hand, this can mean a step in the direction towards Americanization and has been portrayed as such, I believe it meant being responsible to the security of the local Japanese Hawaiian community. With this growing anti-Japanese sentiment we're all aware of, any negative member of the community put undue light onto the community itself. Therefore, was seen as in the best interest of the citizenry that it created to foster a sense of loyalty reflective of a responsibility towards the local Japanese Hawaiian community. And the next level of responsibility was that towards the Japanese nation. Fueled by Japanese exceptionalist discourse, similar in the empire, Japanese language education in Hawaii instilled a similar sense of moral superiority over other residents of Hawaii. The last thing they wanted to be was associated with other unsavory minorities. Representing the strength of Japan at this time meant, as members of a global Japanese nation, justifying the superiority of the community relative to others and their perceived shortcomings, as well as representing Japan and its growing place on the world stage. Lastly, Nikkei citizens were held responsible for, in hindsight, an impossible task, maintaining peace in the Pacific. As the 1930s marched on, conflict between Japan and the US became more of a reality, and living in Hawaii on this border between two burgeoning empires, Nikkei citizens, I'm sorry, I just quoted your book, I'm sorry about that. Nikkei citizens were seen as some of the few who could understand the values of both Japan and the United States. It was thus entrusted to them to demonstrate that cooperation was possible. As ambassadors of understanding, they could bridge the gap and maintain peace for security in the Pacific and their community. When we look at Nikkei citizenry and how it reflected on the Japanese community, we can find that it existed similarly in a precarious state of needing to demonstrate loyalty to the United States. And it was part of a global march that Japan led towards civilization as well, and was in danger of being in this middle of a global conflict, which it desperately tried to avoid. And in 1941, Japanese language schools were closed following the US entry into World War II, and many of their teachers interned, marking an end to an era of the 1930s story of Japanese language education. And by examining what has been, as Professor Yasuo Sakata has said, an understudied era of Japanese overseas history, I hope to have uncovered a new layer of history, that highlights a complex community on the journey to defining its relationship between Japan, the US, and Hawaii. And by doing so, I hope we're able to reimagine our understanding of the relationship between Japan and its overseas community. The Japanese community in Hawaii was part of a wider Pacific network of education and citizenry development. So thank you very much for listening.
So this is a time right before. Great. So wonderful, excellent presentations, and I'm sure you have a lot of questions. So the floor is now open for questions. And we have, let's see, we have until 11:45.
Thank you for wonderful presentations. I have questions for each of the presenters. First of all, with regard to Professor Tokunaga's, could you comment, explain to us, if possible, the scale of the Trans-Pacific sex trade in the area, the region of your focus, so that we can have a better understanding of the historical context, economic and context of this particular migrant case. That's one the question I wanted to ask. With regard to Midori Hidaka, you used the word genocide in relation to the 1937 Haitian massacre. Explain a little bit more about this particular episode and how, I guess that's a question I have. But I'd like to get a little bit more information on that. Thirdly, Rashad, thank you for your presentation. Could you comment as to whether there was any parallel educational effort with other ethnic groups, if you know any, in the Hawaii community to educate themselves on their ethnic citizenry?
So your question is this about the scale of sex industry in Pacific, Trans-Pacific area. So I think first of all, the scale became really small after 1920, after the ban on picture brides in the Western Hemisphere. So the center of the sex industry related to Japan became shifted to the East Asia imperial sphere of Japan. But what I think is important is that because the scale of the sex industry or scale of the migration of women in the Western Hemisphere became small, that's why these women matter a lot. Because, for example, after the 1924 Act, the number of Japanese immigrants to the United States decreased dramatically. But it increased in Mexico. But it was like a few hundred people migrated to Mexico after 1924. So out of them, those victims of sex trafficking would not be that big, because the majority of women who went to Mexico were women who really married to Japanese guys and formed a family. So these 3 or 4 women I mentioned in that my paper really caught the attention of the borderlands community. So even though the scale is small, I would say it's important because it's small, right? So because women is scarce, and those industry, including those mafia, like to use take advantage of the small number of women to or profit from that kind of situation. So anyway, it's small, but it's important because it's right. Thank you.
So in regard to the 1937 Haitian massacre, this particular episode, so at the borderlands between Dominican Republic and Haiti, there was this intermingling of cultures, of race. There was even interchange economically as well, that the people at the borderlands were creating within themselves. And also at the time, the borders weren't strictly placed. So it was very, they could pass in between without being this strictness in between. So the leader, dictator, he wanted to exert his power and control of the Dominican territory and to exclude Haitians from this. And in order for him to seem in control and in power, he organized this massacre. And he even recruited locals that were in the borders that they were threatening the locals that you either kill or you get killed. So that's why even locals were part of the massacre. And it was very traumatic for both sides. But of course, mostly for the Haitian migrants and the ethnic Haitians at the time. And the way for them to supposedly distinguish who was Haitian, they were using very racist techniques, as in not only like the skin color, but also the pronunciation of certain Spanish words. The word perejil, which supposedly Haitians weren't able to pronounce it the way a Spanish speaker could. And that was supposedly also another name for the massacre was the parsley massacre, perejil is parsley. And so it was a very big turning point in the relation between the two countries. And even today, we can see the current president of the DR, Luis Abinader, he is proposing to put a wall, just like Trump, between the borders. So this is a legacy to him. This is a legacy that has been brought down for a very long time and is still alive today. So this is why that massacre is considered like very important in the history of both the entire island.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I mean, the short answer is yes. There is, different communities have their own schools for sure. It's not a uniquely Japanese Hawaiian thing. This comes up a lot, especially after the beginning of the Sino-Japanese War, the Second Sino-Japanese War, where competing Japanese schools and Chinese schools also kind of fight for their own country's support, et cetera, et cetera. And you find that what I've read, the Chinese schools per capita are much more active in that way. I think a couple differences include the scale, because of the demographics of Hawaii at the time, as well as the active involvement of the Japanese government and this to a certain extent pervasive engagement with the consulate, the ministry, educational thinkers, this yugaku trend as well, all of these different things that were coming in, because as Japan grew in this time period, as well as a center for Asian thought and collection of people going from all over the region to Japan to study as well, this fold outside of the empire kind of integrated into that a little bit more than other communities. But thank you for that question.
I have also a three-part question, but I'd like to concentrate it on unexpected commonalities in the three papers. So a continuation of Eiichiro's comment from last night about the place of capitalism. It seems like all three cases involve some kind of financial or accounting fraud or misrepresentation. And I'd like to ask a question about details directed towards that central unifying thematic. So for you, what is your account of motive for the murder? Like, what is this, like a mafia enforcement action where somebody had taken a bribe or failed to pay protection, or like, why was the person killed, or what is your speculation about the connection of the money to the murder? For Midori, I'd like a deeper clarification about what the terms of the lawsuit are and why the Japanese government might be considered liable for misrepresentations, or what kind of reparation might be necessary there. And then third, for Rasad's talk, why and in which ways was the accounting irregularity severe enough to lead to these kinds of questions for an audit? So, I mean, broadly, it seems like, as we well know, in addition to borderlands being a place of easy citizenship, it also appears to be, at least from the example of the three papers, a place where broad financial misrepresentation and problems with good accounting practices for international or transnational financial flows?
Okay, thank you for your question. I didn't have a clear answer to your question because this Mashiko case is a whole mystery. Right? And the Ikuta was murdered after imprisonment, and everything is quite based on the rumors and other things. But I think it's different than money matters. If I frame that in my understanding, it's more like a conflict between the efforts to save face as the good immigrant community and the reality of the male-centered immigrant society. Because where there are crimes, there are bad people, and there are not only people who want to make the immigrant community better, but at the same time there are people who always don't fit in that area. So it's more like about from the conflict within the community in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, and those who want to save face and those who want to do what they really want to do in that area. So I want to look at that kind of complexity of the immigrant society by looking at specific borderlands context.
In regards to the lawsuit, so why does the Japanese government consider that it could be liable? So first of all, the migration movement was organized by programs that were sponsored by the Japanese government. So the Japanese government had direct relation with sending this, doing propaganda about they will literally use the word Caribbean paradise to say that you will be moving to Caribbean paradise, you'll be offered land. In one of the problems that I mentioned is the mistranslation about the land amount, because this was a very appealing aspect of the migration. Because a lot of the people that were applying to migrate agriculture farmers, migrants, right? So being able to own their own land, it was a very big appeal for them. But the amount of land itself it depended on where you got it. Also, the lands in the borderlands, which was obviously what you wanted, a lot of it was very bad land. You didn't even grow much of it. You had to work too much on it, and there wasn't even a proper irrigation system. There was a lot of problems in the infrastructure as well. So it's just like overall, the way the Japanese government, these organizations were putting this program, were not even completely clear about how the situation in the DR was. Plus, whether or not the migrants were aware that there was a dictatorship happening. Maybe they did, but they weren't aware. So it's not completely transparent. So it's an accumulation of issues that led to immigration to have so many problems, and so it really created a rift between the two groups. One being that were against doing the law, others that were pro lawsuit. My understanding is the majority were against the lawsuit. So I would say the minority were organizing this lawsuit. And in 2006, I believe, the prime minister at the time, he apologized formally. But the lawsuit have been in place since maybe like the 1990s. So it took a long time. It was a whole process. Even organization probably was from the 1980s. So it was a whole process.
You're right. So thank you for your question about the accounting irregularities and how severe they were. It comes to how the organization was funded, and that comes from tuition and textbook sales. And if the organization is it was accused of spending frivolously and being in debt, and therefore it was raising textbook prices and tuition, therefore that's making a direct material impact on the people who are engaged with it. So that is one of the reasons. And for example, the organization had spent for multiple trips of people to go to Japan and tour different universities and to gather educational thought from Japan in 1929, 1931. And this was seen as an irresponsible use of funding. The organization, as I said, was in debt as well. And these there was mystery around why these textbook prices were rising and what was happening here. And it was seen as an opaque organization that was, as I said, making a material effect on everyday families. And how could you attack everyday families? This is from the perspective of the Nipujiji, who was making these attacks in the press. This is a narrative play as well, in terms of these are the rivalry between these organizations can't be understated in why these things come to light.
I mean, this is super fascinating, and just as a way to think about how all three papers illustrate how rivalries are so closely tied. I'm curious about why for and against parties within the lawsuit. I mean, there might be historical connections to complicity with the propaganda or being contractors or helping facilitate deceiving their neighbors. I mean, that would be one route for social division. And then also the kinds of questions of conflict of interest about who would take out what loan in what way, what kind of debt structure might be there. So like somebody from a bank involved in the board would all be fascinating.
Thank you all three for the fascinating talks. I have a question for Rashad. I'm really interested in your positioning of the Nikkei education as somewhere between the Japanese education system and public education, the goals of public education in the United States during the period that you focus on. After 1947, the Japanese curriculum emphasized dual goals of internationalization, like kokusaika, and love of country, so aikokushin. So when you were talking about the stated goals of the Nikkei education, it sounded to me like replicating the goals of the Ministry of Education, just replacing with America, right? So love of country is just directed towards America instead of Japan. So, but I only have the post-war education system in mind, and it sounded very similar to that. How can you dive a little bit more deeply into how the Nikkei education system is actually a mix of these two ideologies and not just like replacing nation state names within the framework of one or the other?
Well, I think it's that these ideologies are also built on top of each other over time. The post-war education system doesn't come out of nowhere, obviously, right? So it's built on movements of international education in the 1920s that go around the world, and this idea of also love of country and patriotism is not unique to the Japanese education system in Japan or in the United States. This fostering of loyalty and fostering of what am I going to say, citizenry in general is an integrated process. So I don't know if I'm answering your question at all, but I think one of the key aspects of this is, at least from my perspective, is what are the interests at play in these narratives that are being put out and integrated into this education. And I think that if you're thinking of this internationalization of education or this as you said, in post-war, I think it is part of what are the goals of the Monbusho in that period of time. What are the goals of the Monbusho in the early mid-Taisho period versus late Taisho again to Showa, and how does that change, and how does that reflect on the goals of making it more imperial focused as opposed to general international as well. And then also there's another revitalization of internationalism in education in the 80s. So this circle of internationalism, national education system, and the focus upon which changes and builds through time. And I don't know if I answered your question at all. I might have to ponder those details a little bit and get back to you if that's okay.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much. I have a question for Midori. Actually, I was fascinating to hear about that very little research case that we are. It was striking to me to see that Trujillo was regarding this Japanese Asian migration as a means of widening nation. Like, I think it is a big question in here. Why an Asian group will be a big of whiteness in the DR? So I think it raises a lot of questions about what is whiteness in the Pacific, in the Caribbean. What means whiteness in the Caribbean? What it means also wideness in the broader Latin American framework, since you led comparisons with Brazil and this ideology of widening, which was a very powerful ideological and political tool in the nation building process of all Latin American countries. So my question would be, where these ideas or policies came from? How were they implemented? Can you trace some kind of hemispheric or trans-Pacific or maybe transatlantic networks of knowledge on racial policies? I think this will be a very good questions to know or good questions to ask to such a place your research in a broader kind of hemispheric or maybe trans-Pacific such a framework. So yes, and also another thing that displacing migrants near borders, I think it's another such a point that you also see in the migration policies of Paraguay, for example, which was also joined in was also part of Japanese policy migration programs, which were occurring near the same time in research you were doing, and also in Paraguay. I'm not sure if this. I think if you compare also with Paraguay, which was a case that occurred around the same time, I think there was also stress in Japanese migrants as a force for modernization or boosting the productivity. Not so much widening, but I think the racial politics are quite different in there. But I think you can trace that kind of connections of these early 1950s Japanese immigration program to South America with policies of nation building or economic modernization in each country. Will be, well, I did a lot of questions actually, but will be great to know if you have any thoughts or any answers on these kind of issues.
Those are all great questions that I myself asked myself. Whiteness in Latin America is a very strange phenomenon, I would say, because it's not how it is viewed in the US at all. Whiteness, I use the framework of meritocracy to explain whiteness in a sense, to being not only, I mean, yeah, ethno-racial skin color, but also there is this idea of a more modern culture. This eugenic has a eugenic, roots, more modern culture, more civilized, and so on, and also the higher social status, and so. So whiteness in itself, it's I would say very complex, and it's not straightforward. Like Asian and whiteness, you will think, what's going on, right? But basically, well, in the case of the DR, it was because Trujillo was trying with the European migrants, right? And it didn't work. So it was basically a lot of coincidence that happened historically for the Asian migrants, the Japanese migrants who come to the DR. So this study of how Asians are part of this whiteness in Latin America is very understudied. And I myself would like to study. And thank you for mentioning the case of Paraguay. I will look more into it as well. And also that comes with the idea of boosting productivity, agricultural production, and all that. So yeah, it has economic ramifications as well. So it's all like very jumble of things that comes into all of it: economic, racial, and redefinitions. What is race or in Latin America.
Okay, well, thank you very much for wonderful presentations. Please join me in giving a applause for all these fantastic presentations. Well, welcome back. So the last presenter for the panel today is Andrew Patrick Nelson of Stanford University. Andrew is a PhD candidate in the Japanese linguistics track of the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures right here at Stanford University, with PhD minors, history and linguistics. And the title of his presentation is Imperial Vocabulary, Public Political Discourse of the Japanese Diaspora, 1895 to 1935.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for
come back after a very delicious lunch. Hopefully I can keep this light and exciting, so there's no food coma. I'm excited to share with you some of the work I've been doing with the Hoji Shimbun collection, which is part of the Japanese Diaspora Initiative, as I'm sure you all know. I became interested in the collection when Kay first introduced it to me when I arrived at Stanford. I'm interested in shifting meanings over space and time, and the Hoji collection presented a great opportunity for both a longitudinal study of language change in diaspora, as well as a point of comparison for discourse in the metropole. Today, I'm going to speak a bit about the corpus itself, the kinds of analyses it can afford, the methods I and research assistants used to develop a word modeling program, and a few results. So basically, what are we working with? How do we work with it? And what can it show us? So first, the corpus. As you know, the Hoji Shimbun Digital Archive is, as far as we can tell, the largest collection of Japanese diaspora newspapers in the world, comprising 174 publications from 15 countries, all digitized. It seemed like a great opportunity for some text mining, so I set about seeing whether I could extract trends from uses for political terms. Although the collection holds pages from 174 publications, it does not hold them in equal quantities. So I really wanted to focus in on publications that covered along the way. So I settled on newspapers from San Francisco, Honolulu, Sao Paulo, the greater Beijing area. The key newspapers from these 4 regions offered over 407,000 pages of text, with about 624 million words total. The date ranges, as you can see here, offer about the best overlap that we can hope for, extended from about 1895 to 1952 with a still, there are a few holes, as we can see. For instance, there is a period from 1925 to 1937, for which the collection does not have issues of the Manchu Nichiichi, though it had been published during that time. I know Kay is hard at work continuing to collect, so maybe these holes will be filled in someday. Nevertheless, if we assemble the date ranges that we do have for the newspapers in these locales, we get the best continuity that we can hope for. As we can see, the current corpus affords a fairly decent direct comparison between San Francisco, Beijing Dalian, and Honolulu from 1899 to 1925. And then we can compare San Francisco, Honolulu from 1917 to 1937 with good overlap for all 4 locations from 1917 to 1925. So let's take a look at what we're looking at. Here's a sample from the collection. This is the front page of the daily Nikujiji, published in Honolulu, Hawaii from 1908 to 1942. It was the successor paper of the Yamako, published from 1895 to 1896, and the Yamako Shimbun, published from 1896 to 1906. And both of these are included in the corpus that I'll be using today. This is the first issue in 1908, which came out on January 3rd. So right away, we noticed some features that would be difficult for an optical character recognition program. We need to optically recognize characters in order to run analyses on them computationally. So here we see some characters that are arranged visually in an unconventional way for aesthetic effect. This is common in classified sections where we see highly stylized characters in interesting orientations. Down here, where we find characters that are offset. This is a particularly egregious example of the kinds of damage that have been done to pages over the time. So we see a large tear with a tape mark over it to try to hold it together. Some amount of wear and tear was not at all uncommon. Our newspaper pages from 100 years ago. So wrinkled edges, faded text, and spots of mystery things speckled all of the pages. Here we can find 4 different areas of some discoloration too. So at this juncture, I'm trying to find options for good optical character recognition that would be able to handle the idiosyncrasies of really old newspaper pages. So I had two ways to go. I could find an OCR program that works, or I could develop my own. Developing my own seemed a little high of a challenge, so I saw what was on the market first. So next, I'm going to talk about how I went about evaluating existing OCR documents. So here's an original excerpt of text. I first looked at a PDF text miner called PDF Miner, developed by Yusuke Shinyama, a doctoral graduate in computer science from NYU. PDF Miner was able to handle text direction very well, but as you can see, it was immediately apparent that the character transcription accuracy was not very high. So for this entire original document, all that we can get extracted is what you see on the left. So that was not going to work. Next, I looked at Abby Fine Reader, which is a product developed by Adobe and touted as, quote, the highest quality OCR on the market in PC Magazine. Indeed, it does pretty well. We see text that looks like text with some errors. I've highlighted the characters that don't match the original. And then finally, I looked at the XML outputs generated for the Hoover Institution by a third-party vendor, which did better stuff. And so in order not to reinvent a very complicated wheel, I decided to work with this, but develop a deep understanding of what was going on. The problem with using a third-party vendor is that it's a black box. I can't see what the actual code is doing under the hood. And so I was trying to evaluate how reliable is this OCR program. So if we look at an excerpt from the UGG that we were just looking at, here are some of the kinds of errors that the OCR program had. Ni, kana character ni gets transcribed as a 1 minus. It was often also transcribed as a 1 and a colon. We find here, so tiny, the kanji ju in junyo becomes an exclamation point, number 6. Pulp becomes the less than or equal sign. Ono becomes NK on 10 or 10 on 10. It seems to give up on Zai, where it just leaves an asterisk. Kuni becomes a variant of Yogen of Yo, and troublingly, he becomes a colon followed by 2 exclamation points. This makes a little bit more sense if you rotate it 90 degrees, but so I wanted to know, how common are these different kinds of transformations, and by what measure should I determine whether a given OCR output is even usable for analysis? With the help of an undergraduate research assistant, I began quantifying these errors. So my undergrad research assistant, Sandy Kind, and I painstakingly cataloged 52,000 OCR output characters, comparing them to the original documents. On the left, you can see one of my OCR printouts. On the upper right here, you can see an example of the tally sheets that Sandy and I used to keep track of the number of times the OCR inserted a kanji, punctuation, kana, or alphanumeric character that was not in the original document, the number of times it deleted one of those characters from the original document, or the number of times that it transformed one character type into another character type. And here, you can see where Sandy has kept track of which kanji have been transformed into what. So here are some of the common errors that we found. You saw how it's a little bit messed up. The kanji ichi often just turned into numeral 1. Long lines, including breaks between sections on newspaper pages, also got transcribed as a 1. It struggled with the periods. It either turned into like a Western period or just a large circle. D was also really challenging for the OCR. As for kanji errors, some of them were really easy to see. Like I can see why a program might make errors like that. Other characters seemed to simplify, but then others seemed to become more complex. And then I don't know what's going on. And so it was a little disappointing. I wish, if I knew that every time Tokoro was going to turn into like the Chinese character ting, right? Like I could just write a program that would reconvert them back. But since it seems to be kind of random, I couldn't really rely on that. So why go through all of this trouble? Well, if we were to find that the only thing quote unquote wrong with the OCR outputs was a smattering of errant alphanumeric characters, which should never be there, or strange punctuation, then we'd be golden. I can write a script that will strip all of those out, and we're left with the original text, no problem. But since the substantive terms in Japanese are written in kanji, since we see kanji being transformed into other kanji, I need to know how often is this happening, and how likely is it that one of the key terms I'm looking for is magically appearing where it shouldn't be. So this is too small for anyone to see, but here's how we are, again, painstakingly categorizing all of the different kinds of errors and then determining what the overall accuracy of this OCR program is. In our sample, we found at the end of all of this that there was about an 80% accuracy rate for a kanji. 1 in 5 chance that an original character would be deleted or transformed doesn't sound that great to me. I'm kind of finicky about this. However, among the errors, it was over 5 times more likely that a kanji would be converted into another kanji, a kana or an alphanumeric character, then that kanji would be inserted by mistake. So I was not so worried that originally absent characters are suddenly appearing in the OCR output, which was reassuring. Furthermore, when kanji were inserted, it was very frequently the character ichi, because of the line breaks in the newspaper page, which was the result of OCR mistakes. So I wasn't too worried about high kanji character insertion because most of the time it was just ichi. So it wasn't really affecting the meaning of the output. And finally, the likelihood that a kanji character swap would be swapped into a character I'm looking for was relatively low, right? You have a 1 in 2,000 chance when that is going to show up. So I accepted that 20% error is our baseline, knowing that it's going to be an underrepresentation rather than an overlay. Still, I wondered whether I could do better than 20%. I attempted 3 methods for discerning and filtering out bad OCR outputs. Another research assistant, Victor Chariot, and I tried to develop a classifier that would separate good and bad OCR outputs based on the samples that Sandy and I graded, but there just wasn't enough data in the training set for that. Instead, I thought of a way to use character type proxy. Here we have an excerpt from the actual newspaper in blue. Below in pink is the corresponding text output from the OCR program. In practice, the blue text is unavailable to us because, of course, we're trying not to read 400,000 pages of text. So we can use UCAB, which is a part of speech and morphology parser developed at the Graduate School of Informatics at Kyoto University to parse the text, as we see here. And then we can remove the characters that we know don't belong. Since punctuation unconventional to Japanese newspapers, like the dot, period, comma, semicolons, etc., do not appear in the original, we can suppose that any occurrence must have been wrong. And I thought a high removal rate might suggest high errors overall. Similarly, a different method I tried, we don't expect to see alphanumeric characters. So by counting how many of these there are, we can get a proxy for how many things were replaced. And then finally, we can look at word boundaries. So if kanji are showing up in places that they shouldn't be, they're going to break that word into its constituent elements. And so I thought, well, let's see how many elements get isolated if we take out just the kana characters, for example. I thought an isolated kana character is a suggestion that a word boundary. So I thought, starting with the number of characters that were in the original output, and then using the removal of punctuation or alphanumeric characters or isolated, like orphaned kana characters, would give a proxy. But unfortunately, none of this really worked. So 80% was the best. So I'm satisfied that I looked at the 3 best OCR methods that I could find. I made sure that the output was underrepresenting rather than overrepresenting, and I made sure that there was no way that I could think of to weed out bad OCR outputs. So we're stuck with the 80%. Here's some things that would be left behind even after all of those filters. All right, so now we get to the point where I can generate some outputs. But I wanted to do a gut check on whether these outputs are really reflecting real trends in the data. So I'm thinking, okay, what word can I look for that I might expect some kind of like temporal variation? Well, why not spring? So these are all of the occurrences as raw counts of the character Haru in San Francisco newspapers from 1922. And I held my breath as this showed up, and I was very relieved because they peak in spring when I would want them to, and they taper off throughout the summer, reaching a low point in October. Oh, great, we have seasonal variation in the data for a seasonal term. This is fantastic news. Okay, well, that worked, but what about summer? Summer was not an impressive graph. However, even though these bars don't look terribly different when I use this y-axis, they are still statistically significantly different from each other as a function of month. And if I change the y-axis, we can actually see that there is a significantly higher occurrence of the term summer in the summer. Same is true for autumn. And then a mystery occurs in the wintertime. One question, well, maybe in San Francisco, there's not really winter, so we can talk about winter this anytime. A friend of mine who works on classical Japanese poetry pointed out that winter is not an emotive term that would be used in writing terribly often. There's also, when I workshopped this before, some people asked whether that character occurs in compound terms. I know of winter melon, but I couldn't think of any other terms. So that one is a mystery still. Still, I thought, okay, it seems to suggest that there might be trends that I can actually see in the data. Thank you. So now I'm going to show what that looks like with a political term. You're about to see a dynamic bar graph that starts in 1895. And as it goes through, you're going to see the rate of occurrence per 10,000 words for each of these four areas fluctuate. And then after this dynamic presentation, I'll show you what the like the overview, like static graph is. So once I start, it's just going to go on its own. So here we go. So here's the word Gendai. So not a lot of activity in San Francisco and Hawaii. It's more activity in Beijing Dalian around the 1920s. More and more people are talking about getting more in the 40s, and there it goes. You noticed that the bars seemed to disappear for a second and then come back. Again, that's the gap in the newspapers that we have. So here's the overview. So what does this mean? Like, what is this actually telling us? So I happen to know, thanks to Kay, that the Manshu Nichi Nichi, one of the two newspapers published in China that is part of this corpus, was directly invested in and managed by the Japanese National Policy Company. So in 1927, it merged with a private paper, the Ryodo Shinpo, and was renamed the Manshu Nichi in 1927. This is precisely in the period when the South Manchuria Railway Company was building an empire of its own in Asia. And during this period, the railway company contributed a quarter of the tax base for the entire empire. So in the 1920s, we see government-sponsored newspapers talking about modernity and development. This seems to fit a story that we know. What's really curious to me is that although San Francisco and Hawaii, they're not using the term modernity as much, when they do fluctuate, they fluctuate together, which is kind of maybe suggestive that ideas about modernity were being discussed in the newspapers in a similar way at the same time. Let's do another one. Here's the word constitution. Here we go. So with the previous example, I kind of had a sense of the history of Manchuria, so I could tell a story about that. I do not know my Brazilian history very well, but as I watched Facundo watching this, I can see him nodding when it gets to the 30s. So we have this enormous spike in Sao Paulo, and I thought, well, goodness, like, why is that the case? So I looked into it, and it was pretty easy to identify after I looked. This was when the drafting of the third Brazilian constitution was taking place. So we can see evidence that the Japanese community in Sao Paulo is involved in conversations where they are discussing political developments in Brazil. Am I done warning? Okay, great. This is the beginning, right? It took an enormous amount of effort from myself and my research assistants to get the data to a point where A, we knew it was reliable, and B, we knew it was actually telling a story. Now it gives us a keyhole to look into what those stories actually are, and C, prompt us to ask, well, there is a significant difference here. I can see it in the data now. What is the story? And hopefully, I hope to develop this to the point where many researchers can use it to do their own theories and kind of prompt new questions for investigation. Thank you.
The other three papers, but we have, let's see, 8 minutes for a question. Yes,
A
yes.
simple question about the modernity issue. You didn't do the Kindai
Oh, yeah, I could.
search or
I haven't looked at.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I forgot to mention, I have here, so if I go back, well, let's just do Constitution since it's up on the board. So I also looked at how frequently these terms were showing up in newspapers using a corpus developed by NITL, so the National Institute of Language Study in Japan. If we look at this chart, oh gosh, the y-axis is kind of small. Info shows up in metropolitan newspapers like the Yomiuri Shimbun at a rate of 0.9 occurrences per 10,000 words. And we can see that most of the time, the occurrence of Kenpo in my corpus are below that, but notably in Brazil, suddenly it exceeds the amount of times people would be talking about it. So comparing metropolitan newspaper occurrence rates to what's happening in the diaspora, we can also get a sense of like, is this just like baseline normal conversation level, or are things actually exceeding what we would normally?
I was curious if there was a way to kind of figure out without knowing if there were certain terms that kind of pop up in multiple locations at the same time, and then to maybe figure out if there are links between presses in different parts of the diaspora.
So if I understand correctly, it would just be a matter of including those other newspapers. Right now, the program that I run draws on the OCR outputs for just the newspapers in those 4 areas that I looked at, and that's just because they had the most continuous coverage. So if I included the publications from the other places in the diaspora, then absolutely I would be able to get that broad view, but there would be more holes in it, like we saw even for.
I mean, I figure like you could do this, but I was wondering if you have, because I mean, if you're taking out words per 10,000, not all words in a newspaper are created equal. Right, so front page, top news, advertisements are different. It's kind of like segmentation of it. I don't know if you've done that yet, or you're going down that route, but I'm interested.
Yeah, thank you. I did think about that. The challenge, getting front page stuff is really easy because the data are separated by page. So I know what front pages are, and I can very easily weight words that occur in those files. The sections become trickier because the optical character recognition software doesn't know where the boundaries on the page are. So I would have to train a model on that to be able to kind of like machine learn where things were on the page. And even it would be possible with just effort to train it to recognize, is this a serial piece of fiction? Is this a political news story? Is this an advertisement? So that is possible. It would just take more.
So I actually want to ask you, Andrew, to share with us how this project connects with your dissertation project. You haven't had a chance to do that.
So my dissertation is intellectual history of linguistics in the Meiji period. And so it doesn't really connect very directly. However, while I was working on this and ran into the issue of not being able to compare newspapers in the diaspora directly to newspapers in the metropole, because Asahi and Yomiuri look really long, so I can't do text mining on those. But I discovered that NINJAL, the National Institute for Language Study, actually has at least Yomiuri and several magazines as part of its corpus. So I thought, I can use that corpus as a back way into text mining newspapers that I myself can't access. And while I was doing that with these terms, I realized, oh my gosh, if I'm looking at the use of terms related to language among these Meiji linguists, I can also look at how those terms are being used in broader society at the same time to see whether the linguists are thinking in a new way. So although the project didn't start out as related to my thesis at all, the methods that I started experimenting with for this project lend themselves to the dissertation.
Great. Oh, yes. Azuma Sensei, do you want to go first?
A quick question for those of us who actually research on like immigrant newspapers, international newspapers, we sometimes stumble upon like imingo, sort of a kind of made up terms by immigrants and stuff. Is there any kind of function that you can maybe sort of identify those things, or maybe your research? Do you actually look into sort of a made up terms by those immigrants?
There's two ways to get into that. I haven't done it myself, but I could, if I knew what the terms were, I could just plot them into my model and it would turn out all the occurrences of those words. If I wanted to do it the other way, where I said, here's a body of text, figure out for me what are the borrowed words, there's a way to do that too, because there are dictionaries, like period-oriented dictionaries of Japanese words. And so you just cross-reference. So if this given, you scan through all the text, check, is it in the dictionary? And if it's not, you plug it out, and now you have a list of all of the, or candidates for them you have to read one. That would be possible.
Another small question, but about the use of other languages within, sometimes these newspapers produce like, English versions or second like editions that are English, or even other communities if you want to expand beyond this Japanese sense. I'm wondering, I mean, if you've segmented on that already, or
I have not, but that's actually way easier because the parsers for European languages use white space, right? So I just find the white spaces and now it's parsed. The trouble with Japanese is that white spaces, so you have to refer to a dictionary and do all that. This model is not language specific in terms of output, so I could do searches in Japanese newspapers for English terms too.
Thank you, Andrew, for your